Welcome to physical, hybrid, and virtual media teams. So the purpose of this module essentially is to kind of have more of a discussion with you guys and for us to see where do media teams go from this point on, because obviously there's been a lot of changes happening in the organization, and especially within media teams, the virtual format we have been following over the past year has really changed the dynamic and also the content we create as media. So feel free to interject, to offer your thoughts, to just kind of have a conversation with everyone, because that's the central kind of purpose of this module. All right, let's begin. So as you guys know, having been part of all these different kind of formats, the past few years have been very transformative and reformative for EYP and EYP Media. Because of COVID, that meant that we had to adapt really fast, especially for our events, but also within our team structures, and also rethink how sessions are conducted and how we carry out everything. So we really just had to kind of build from the ground up and kind of translate everything we did in physical sessions through a virtual kind of environment. But now we're at a point where physical sessions are making a comeback, but we're also keeping virtual and hybrid sessions, at least for the foreseeable future, since COVID doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, unfortunately. So as long as we have all these different formats, how do we re-assimilate media, and how do we create the kind of structure that actually works within a virtual environment? And I guess this module is pretty much focusing on that kind of topics. Yeah, let me just see what else. So at times I might come across as anti-virtual session. I want to clarify from the beginning, I'm not. For me, it's more about how media teams need to adapt within the virtual environment. And I think, especially from a different perspective, virtual sessions have allowed us to be more inclusive, in the sense that people who may come from different economic backgrounds or from a different geographic location that didn't allow them to travel as much to different sessions now have access to sessions in a virtual way. So that means we get more participants, we get more people joining EYP, and we get more people being active citizens within the European Union, which I think is a really great advantage that came out of the COVID situation and the rise of virtual sessions. And I also think with more virtual sessions, there is less demand for financial support and less resources, which makes it easier to organize even more events and reach out to even more people. So it's a kind of a cycle that allows us to bring more and more people into the organization and kind of raise more awareness, which also leads to increased outreach through EYP and also through more local branches of EYP. Right. So as you know, EYP Media exists within all three session formats, but I believe there's different expectations, dynamics, and results that come out of each format. So for example, in physical sessions, you have all participants present, and you can interact within the session bubble. You can get to know people and have discussions with them. And that allows the content that we create to be influenced by that direct communication we have with all the participants. And you also have the external elements like the partners and the city that the session takes place in and the locals. So it just gives a lot of creative freedom, especially to media team members, because it means they have this huge canvas they can use to create content. But then you have the virtual sessions where participants attend from home and virtually. So you have this mixture of the two. And depending on what, because a hybrid session isn't really very well defined. It might be that just the organizers are together. It might be just the officials together, and it might be just half and half, where you have some officials joining and some officials joining virtually. So it is still two-dimensional, I think, but there is more room for organic interaction and in-person interaction. And then EYP Media exists within all these different formats. So looking at the elements of change in media teams, and what I mean by this is the elements that were mostly affected once virtual sessions came to be. So what had to shift, alternate, and change due to our transition to hybrid and online events. So you have projects, output, and content, which is, I think, the most obvious thing that needed to change. So how we create content, how we publish it, where we share it, and also who we share it with. So you would have content that gets shared only within the session, so interactive media projects that require the in-person participants to take part. And then in a virtual setting, how do you do that? Do you put everyone in break rooms? Do you kind of engage only with the media team to create these projects? What is the approach we take? And then also stuff like committee pictures and session pictures and pictures of the events taking place. All those very, very central stuff you would do at a physical session as a media team member are suddenly not there. So what kind of content can you create as a media team member? And then we have interactions with other session participants. So like I said before, conversations, organic interactions, discussions, these kind of things have a really big impact on the inter-session media projects. And also it kind of allows the media team to be more integrated within these events. Whereas if you have a virtual event, the media team becomes more external to the process, because you're not sharing, so you're not in direct contact with the delegates, and you're not the president, so you're not overseeing what everyone else is doing. So in this new virtual environment, the media team needs to reallocate itself and find ways to still be part of the session, even though they're not interacting with everyone in the way they would in a physical session. And then we have the training and development. So the way we train media team members, the subject and the content of the training. So for example, if I was editing a session that is physical, we would definitely have modules on photography, on videography, on how to approach chairs and have conversations with delegates, that kind of thing that is essential in a physical context. And suddenly you need to rethink what kind of development the media team members need to have in a virtual session. So you can teach them photography, but they're not going to use it unless you want them to take pictures using a DSLR camera of the computer in front of them. But at the end of the day, there is much more of a limited room to really use the skills that you're teaching them, especially when it comes to photography and videography. And that's where we need to reconsider what we teach in trainings in virtual media teams. And then finally, it's the impact, the goals, and the objectives. So what does a virtual media team aim to achieve, and what kind of impact do we want to have on participants that are not there in a physical presence with us? Like, what are the new goals we have? So for example, in a physical session, you would say, I wanted to create a great session video. I want to capture spontaneous moments. I want to get people's thoughts on different topics. And then suddenly you need to rethink those goals and aims, and you have to kind of redefine what you're striving for as a media team member and an editor. So the entire vision of the media team needs to change. So taking those elements we discussed, I just wanted to kind of break it down into different formats. So for the physical media team, where you have all these different kind of elements. So you have project output and content, where it's influenced by its surroundings, it's promoted within the session bubble, and it's also based on the participants and the vision, as well as it not being always in digital form. So for example, when I was a media team member, we used to do a lot of kind of projects that were pretty much limited within the session. You wouldn't take pictures of them or anything, but it would require the participants of the session to actually take part and contribute. So it was very much those kind of projects that just are there for engagement and interaction more than anything else. But also, I think the most important part is having like a numerous amounts of mediums and platforms to work with. Either that's photography, videography, graphic design, anything that really comes out in your head. The physical session allows you to explore all of those mediums if you want to. And then we have the interaction, which, as we said, it's much more organic and active, in person, but also collaborative, especially when it comes to projects. And it's also what allows the media to integrate itself within other officials teams, and also the entire session overall. Then we have training and development, which again, it's in person, it's practical, it allows you to experiment and have the editorial team there to assist you if you need help, gives you a chance to experiment and also to learn from the people around you. So for example, when I was a journalist at the Valencia International session, I had no idea how to Photoshop. I still don't, but there were people there that could help me learn how to Photoshop. And then I was there and I could show people how to edit written content better. And you have this general exchange of knowledge, and you walk away from that session having learned something else. I mean, I won't be using my Photoshop skills anytime soon, but I definitely enjoyed having someone show me how this works. So yeah, it's a lot about drawing inspiration from your surroundings, and also having that kind of organic rhythm and pace that kind of gets eliminated in virtual sessions. And then again, we have impact and goals. So you have a clear vision, you have comprehensive aims, you have achievable objectives that you can create and do within the session. And then you also have much more of a lasting impact and influence on others, and not just your media team, because you can see how your content and your projects kind of had an influence on the people around you, which I think is one of the most rewarding things about having projects in the first place. How these elements work within the hybrid and virtual teams. I mean, like I said, hybrid teams can be physical, especially if the media team is present, as well as the organizing team and the chairs team. So you have the entire officials team being present, but not the participants. But I think at the end of the day, it can still be very limiting, although not as limiting, or challenging rather, as virtual teams. So let's see. I also want to add another disclaimer that, as I have never attended a virtual hybrid session as a media team member, this kind of perspective I'm showing you here is very much what I've kind of considered, but I haven't experienced myself. So if you have other input and experiences, just feel free to kind of drop them in while we're discussing this. So we have the project and output content, which is much more digital, as you guys already said, and also less conventional mediums. So I think this is where you may see kind of a silver lining, where you need to experiment and be more creative to create something that you wouldn't normally in a physical session. So whether that's a graphic design project or an illustration, an animation, virtual interviews with participants, you get pushed to a point where you need to create something much more unconventional. And then there's a consideration that if virtual sessions continue to happen, do we need to convert back to EYP journalism? Because I don't know if you guys were there at the History of EYP Media, where we're discussing the difference between EYP journalism and EYP media, and how we've moved on from journalism and now moved into a much more broader kind of spectrum. But yeah, when I say EYP journalism, what I mean is creating session issues and magazines and distributing them online to the participants. And so going back to articles and that kind of a style of content. Then we have the interaction, which, as we said, it's limited, it's less organic, and also it's more two-dimensional. So you're not really getting what you would be getting in a physical session. Then the training and development, which again would be more theoretical and less practical, unless the editor and the editorial team really encourage their team to just go out there, even if it's not for the session, go out there and work on your practical skills and at least get something out of this session, even though you're not going to be using those skills within the session. So constricted opportunities for development. I don't think I phrased that very well, in the sense that I don't think you cannot develop within a virtual session, but rather the areas that you can develop in are more limited than what they would be normally. But again, it goes back to being able to develop in other areas you normally wouldn't. So it's kind of like a balance, and it really depends on how motivated you are to develop in other areas. And again, focusing on other mediums, so utilizing the more digital and two-dimensional kind of mediums available to you. Impact and goals. Well, I think this is where I think we have to start in order to rebuild media within virtual sessions. What is our impact? What are our goals, and what do we aim to achieve? So how do we rethink our impact within a virtual context? Yes, I think that's what I was going to say. But also, I want to clarify that this isn't a discussion of virtual sessions versus physical sessions, but rather it's much more about finding the key differences and understanding how we can optimize and maximize media teams' participation within every single session format that we have. So it's about creating unique identities for media teams, depending on what format they are being used in. So where do we go from here, and how do we redefine EYP media for each format? So like I said, we need to create kind of a new identity, because I think the problem is we're trying to replicate and recreate the same dynamic and the same kind of content that we would in a physical session, and that's why it's not getting translated very well. That obviously you cannot do the same you would in a physical session in a virtual format. So it's all about rethinking how we approach this, and also having a unique identity. And then there's the utilizing new mediums and platforms, which beyond photography and videography, what else is there for media teams to do? What other tools do we have that we can utilize, and how can we utilize them to make media teams be more integrated in virtual sessions? And then also rethinking team dynamics, both within the media team, but also within the session itself. So how do we interact with other officials, and also how do we interact with ourselves? For example, in a physical session, you have the media room where everyone meets and exchanges ideas and helps each other with projects. So how can you achieve not a similar, because that would be kind of counter the point I made earlier about replicating stuff, but rather what kind of team dynamic can we have through a virtual medium? How do we create a team that is not sharing a media room and sharing the same physical space? And I think those are mainly the 3 points we need to answer before we can begin kind of reintroducing media in virtual sessions. Other considerations, which I think beyond virtual sessions and hybrid and physical are affecting EYP media overall, is I think what you can see in the screen. So new generation of EYP media team members. So I said yesterday during the history of EYP media that we need to consider that we have an entire generation of EYPers who grew up in the online session kind of format, and they're not familiar with how physical sessions work and how media teams in a physical session would normally run. So how does that kind of gap of experience and knowledge affect physical teams from here on now? And also, how will this change the dynamics, the processes, and the structures of media teams moving forward? Other than that, we have trends, development, and change of pace. So as we discussed yesterday again in history of media, of EYP media, we went very much from a very journalistic kind of structure where you had journalists creating articles and issues to something that's much more wider and creative, like having social media channels like Snapchat and then Instagram and then Facebook and TikTok, and basically just moving with the time and our audience. So even if we went back to creating issues, the chances of someone actually sitting down and reading a virtual magazine would be very limited. Because I think, especially with younger EYPers as well, I don't even think it's a generational thing. I think that nowadays we really don't have the attention span to really sit down and read articles about an EYP session. We just mostly require stimulation through fast-paced content like videos and images and GIFs and memes and all that kind of stuff that you can consume really quickly, take something out of them, and then kind of move on to something else. And I think that's a consideration we need to have overall in media, not just virtual sessions, that unless we adapt so that we can keep up with the audience and the people receiving the content we create, we can't really have an impact, and we can't really integrate ourselves properly. And then lastly, which cannot be, we can't really not mention this, how has COVID impacted how we view the world, how we view EYP, and also how we approach media? How do we communicate information now, and how do we understand how the world works around us? And I think that's something that all of us collectively have to kind of process and work through before we can start creating content again.